what have you got? You've got the basis, you have the equivalent in 2010 of what the Nazis had to do the Holocaust. God forbid you should combine that with a national ID card, okay? But you're basically you're turning over to a small handful of private, powerful interests, a complete database on this country that, combined what they have through the banking and other systems, is unbelievably phenomenal. And you layer on top of that artificial intelligence. Now, at the heart of any health situation, you have a patient and a doctor. And the thing that most protects that patient is the oath that doctor takes. That doctor's ethical commitment is to do whatever is in your interest. So if I'm in an emergency room and I'm trying to save your life, I don't think, giving you this shot of adrenaline is more expensive than you can afford. My obligation is to save your life. When you fundamentally re-engineer the government rules and regulations so that they supersede that oath, then you're talking about creating a world in which your power as a citizen is radically diminished, because I'm cutting off from you the information and resources you need to make wise decisions about your health. Now, we're talking about health care. That change is happening across the board. The IRS is requiring tax preparers to enroll in, with the IRS and become not your tax preparer with ethical obligations to you, but their enforcement arm. So it's your doctor, it's your tax preparer, it's your accountant. All across the board, the professionals that you use in every aspect of your life are suddenly having their regulatory structure re-engineered so that person's ethical obligation is to the government and not you. And what that means is you can then be literally at the most intimate levels of your life and your finances. Your whole life can be engineered to serve the corporations and not you.
Monarchy gave way to oligarchy in England long ago with the arrival of the Venetian bankers and William of Orange. That's when England's people lost England to the Dutch, Swiss, and wealthy elite resource monopoly families in the Livery Guild memberships. By creating a voting England, a corrupted system of fair play could be promoted among the people, so the oligarchy can do pretty much what they want, wrapped in a Union Jack. Let's have another look at this picture. The marriage of William of Orange to Mary II in 1677. First of all, they were first cousins. Second of all, William was 27, Mary was 15. Third, William was an open homosexual. But I guess this is all okay. These are royals. I doubt little William came over in an armada and conquered England, but I bet some old bankers did. And that seems to be where we are in the world. Once wealth gets to the point where you can buy anything, you can employ anyone to do anything. For instance...
Copy. This is what the City of London has your kids doing tonight. Let's see which position. You got it. Here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Chairman Bernanke, earlier you were asked a question about the value of the dollar, and you sort of deferred and said, you know, that's the Treasury's responsibility. I always find this so fascinating because it's been going on for years. Your predecessor would always use that as an excuse to not talk about the value of the dollar, but here I find the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who's in charge of the dollar, in charge of the money, in charge of what the money supply is going to be, but we don't deal with the value of the dollar. But you do admit you have a responsibility for prices. But you know, the hard money economists who have been around for a while, they have always argued that this would be the case. Those who want to continue to inflate will never talk about the money.
Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Bernanke, I'm looking at the report that you handed out this morning, and I was wondering if you could take your copy and turn to page 26.
Okay.
There's a table on page 26 which consists of your balance sheet, and one of the entries on the balance sheet is under assets, central bank liquidity swaps, which shows an increase from the end of 2007 from $24 billion to $553 billion in change at the end of 2008. What's that?
Those are swaps that were done with foreign central banks. Many foreign banks are short dollars and into our markets looking for dollars and drive up interest rates and create volatility in our markets. What we have done is, with a number of major central banks, like the European Central Bank, for example, we swap our currency, dollars, for their currency, euros. They take the dollars, lend it out to the banks in their jurisdiction. That helps bring down interest rates in the global market for dollars. And meanwhile, we're not lending to those banks, we're lending to the central bank. The central bank is responsible for repaying us.
So who got the money?
To financial institutions in Europe and other countries.
Which ones?
I don't know.
$500 billion, and you don't know who got the money?
The loan went to the loans go to the central banks, and they then put them out to their institutions to try to bring down short-term interest rates in dollar markets around the world.
Well, let's start with which central banks got the money.
There are 14 of them, which are listed in our. I'm sure they're listed in here somewhere.
All right. So who actually made that decision to hand out $1 trillion that way? $500 billion. Who made that decision?
The Federal Open Market Committee.
Okay. And was it done at one time or in a series of meetings?
A series of meetings.
And under what legal authority?
We have a long-standing legal authority to do swaps with other central banks. It's not an emergency authority of any kind.
Anything specific about it?
Do you know my counsel says Section 14 of the Federal Reserve Act.
All right, we actually looked at one of the arrangements, and one of the arrangements is $9 billion for New Zealand. That works out to $3,000 for every single person who lives in New Zealand. Seriously, wouldn't it be better to extend that kind of credit to Americans rather than New Zealanders?
It's not costing Americans anything. We're getting interest back, and it comes back. It's not at the cost of any American credit. We are extending credit to Americans.
Well, wouldn't it necessarily affect the credit markets if you extend $500 billion in credit to anybody?
We are lending to all U.S. financial institutions in exactly the same way.
Well, look at the next page. The very next page has the U.S. dollar nominal exchange rate, which shows a 20% increase in the U.S. dollar nominal exchange rate at exactly the same time that you were handing out $500 billion to foreigners. Do you think that's a coincidence?
Yes.
So who owns the Federal Reserve Bank Corporation? The Rothschilds and the Bank of England and the London banking houses ultimately control the Federal Reserve banks through their stock holdings of bank stock and their subsidiary firms in New York. The two principal Rothschild representatives in New York, J.P. Morgan Company and Kuhn Loeb and Company, were the firms which set up the Jekyll Island Conference at which the Federal Reserve Act was drafted, who directed the subsequent successful campaign to have the plan enacted into law by Congress, and who purchased the controlling amounts of stock in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in 1914. These firms had their principal officers appointed to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and the Federal Advisory Council in 1914. In 1914, a few families, blood or business related, owning controlling stock in existing banks, such as in New York City, caused those banks to purchase controlling shares in the Federal Reserve regional banks. In the Housing Banking Committee staff report of August 1976 and the current stockholders list of the 12 regional directors of the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks show the same family control.
The Federal Reserve ever tried to manipulate the U.S. stock market?
No, sir. Not that I'm aware of.
Not that you're aware of, but you're the attorney, right?
That's right.
So you might not even know, right?
I would expect to know if there were something like that being done. I'm not aware of that at all.
And if you did know, you'd be bound by attorney-client privilege, and you wouldn't be able to tell us, right?
Sir, if there were something the Federal Reserve were doing outside its legal authority, I would have an obligation to say something about that.
All right, so we agree that any participation by the Federal Reserve in the stock market or the futures market is outside the Federal Reserve's legal authority, right?
The Federal Reserve has some authority to regulate various aspects of markets and participate in markets in certain ways. So I think your question is too categorical, but...
I think not, actually. Why don't you answer it?
I don't know what would... I don't know... Your question is so overbroad, I don't know where to begin to answer that.
I don't think it's that overbroad. I'd like you to tell me whether it's within the Federal Reserve's legal authority to try to manipulate the stock market or the futures market.
So I don't believe the Federal Reserve tries to manipulate the stock market.
Tries? Come on.
No, so...
Do they?
The Federal Reserve's obligation and what it does in monetary policy is try to influence interest rates, and in that way to maximize employment and to stabilize prices.
Now,
sure
if in fact the Federal Reserve
question.
were trying to do that or doing it, isn't that something that we'd want to know?
And the extent that the Federal Reserve influences interest rates, it does make announcements of that decision immediately.
That's not what I said. I said manipulate the stock market or the futures market. Wouldn't we want to know? Yes or no?
Could you define what you mean by...
I think you know what I mean, Mr. Alvarez. Now, wouldn't it be very helpful to have a GAO audit on that subject? Wouldn't it?
I don't know what it is that you're seeking to audit, sir.
What I
it would
just
be helpful
said.
If you could
Let's go on to
your
something else. Does the Federal Reserve actually possess all the gold that's listed on their balance sheet? Do they actually possess it?
Yes.
Has that been audited by the GAO?
I believe that's within the GAO's authority to audit. It certainly is something that our independent accountant is able to verify and does.
So if I go ahead and ask for a GAO audit, you won't oppose it, right?
To auditing the presence of the gold on the facility? I don't see any reason to object to that.
Good. Now, there's been all sorts of claims of insider trading and front-running by the people who execute the trades for the Federal Reserve in the market. By the way, who is that? Who actually executes the trades for the Federal Reserve in the markets?
I haven't heard of any allegations of front-running.
Well, that's funny because you're the general counsel, so if anybody would know about it, you'd think you would know about it.
The Federal Reserve Bank of New York is responsible for affecting the transactions implementing monetary policy.
Okay, so then answer the question.
The Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
That's your answer?